Boker Tov. Today's daf is daf Tzadik Aleph in Bab Messias. We've been prachenu kol basis for soon Batzar v'Shivya. So we saw yesterday, the end of yesterday, the top of the page here in daf Tzadik Aleph. We talked about the issue of if you cause the animal, you muzzle the animal just by speech. Rabbi Yochanan says you're chayiv because Rabbi Yochanan says that moving your mouth in talking is also a ma'isa, and Rish Lakish says that it's not. And we asked the kasha from the case of Tmura, where you're not allowed to exchange one animal, a holy animal, for another. But if you do, it has an effect, even though it's only words. So the Gemara's answer is that Akash and Rish Lakish, because the Chorah to prove to Rabbi Yochanan that words alone is a ma'isa. So Rish Lakish said no, that goes according to Yehuda, says that a lav she'em ma'isa. There is no ma'isa there. Rish Lakish says words is not a ma'isa. But it goes according to Yehuda, also lav she'em b'ma'isa lokan alav. Even though the Mishnah is not exactly like Rabbi the Gemara said, because the Mishnah Chiddush is that a Yorish could be made when Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold that way. So the Tana of the Mishnah holds like Rabbi Yehuda in one sense, that lav she'em b'ma'isa lokan alav, and he doesn't hold like Rabbi Yehuda in the other sense. And just mention it because that's really this week's parsha of Lo Yomir V'Leich Lifenu about Tmura. So we're about the 10th line down on the page where we left off yesterday. Let's say you actually do muzzle your animal. You can muzzle your animal. You can muzzle your dog if you're walking down the street, right? But you can't muzzle your animal when it's threshing for you. If you muzzled your animal and then you threshed with it, so we're over in the Torah, because Torah says lo sachsim is a shor bedisho. Don't muzzle your animal when he's threshing your produce, right? So loka, you get malchus for that. But lav sheish b'maisa. Even Rish Lakish, who holds that a lav shein b'maisa a loka, but here you did a maisa. You muzzled the animal, right? So he said you muzzle the animal while you threshed. You get malchus for that. And then there's a knas u'mishalim dalit kavim lapara v'gimel kavim l'chamor. Not only that, since you muzzled your animal, okay, that means that if you muzzle the animal, you must pay. The one who muzzled his animal must pay for the animal's food. You muzzle them, that means you prevented him from eating. How much does he eat in a day? Let's say a cow eats 4 kav and a chamor eats 3 kav of food. So therefore, the one who muzzled the animal would have to pay the owner of the animal. The owner of the animal, now obviously if it's the same person, if he's muzzling his own animal, he's got to feed his animal. But let's assume that the owner of the field rented an animal, right, from somebody else, and that person, and now he muzzled the animal, so the animal shouldn't eat. That's how much money he owes the owner of the para or the chamor, respectively, for having prevented him from eating that day. Says the Gemara Kasha, we have a klal of kamlev rabminei. If there's 2 punishments you're supposed to get, you get the stricter one, but you only get one. But ain't loco mace. We have a klal, you don't get malchus and die. In other words, if you did some avera for which you're chayiv at the same time malchus and misa, you only get misa, you only get the stricter one, the ain't loco mishaling. And if you're gonna get malchus, you don't pay. So over here, since you're getting malchus, for what? For muzzling your animal, muzzling this animal while he's threshing for you, so you shouldn't have to pay. Amar Abaya. So Abaya says, okay, on money Rav Meir goes like Rav Meir, Amar Loka Mashalim, there's a machlokes. Yeah, there's machlokes in Malchus and elsewhere. Can you get malchus and also pay? Rav Meir says, yes, you do. Loka Mashalim. He doesn't hold it back. Loka Mashalim. Yes, he agrees probably in the case of Kol Rabbi with Misa, but in the case of malchus and Tashlumin, you can get both. That's one answer. Rav Amar, and look at the girsa in the Bach, because he has more. It's just not one word. Rav says, shemayim. He's talking about when he wants to be yotzi de chavos. So what does that mean? That Bezin cannot impose on you 2 different punishments. So you get the stricter one. You don't do both. So in a chanami, if you're chayav malchus and you have to pay, you only get the malchus. You don't have to pay. However, you really still owe the money. Give an example. Let's say on Shabbos we have what's the famous case? On Shabbos you threw a knife, right, from one rishus into another, and on the way you ripped somebody's shirt. Okay, so we say since you're chayav misa on Shabbos, even if you only should get the punishment, but if you did an avera for you're chayav misa, so you don't have to pay for the shirt. That's the rule, right? Since you're chayav misa, you don't have to pay for the shirt. However, you really owe the money. You just don't. We can't impose on you that strictness that having to pay because you're chayav misa. But technically, if you want to be yotzei, you're chov, you really do owe the guy the money because he tore his shirt. And that's what he says, Rava, and so Rava says that you're coming to Shemaim. And then he goes on, and this we have, Esnan Asa Torah Vafilu Baal Imo. The Torah says that if you pay a prostitute a gift, it's called an Esnan Zona, you can't use that as a carbon in the base of Mikdash. So let's say the Esnan was a lamb. You gave her a lamb as your payment. You can't use that in the base of Mikdash. It's also Lo Sabi Esnan Zona Mechir Kel Beis Hashem Alekecha. Right? That's the pasuk goes on. So you can't. Now let's say the prostitute was chasva his own mother. He slept with his mother. Right? If he slept with his mother, Chayiv Misa for that, obviously, right? He slept with his mother, and yet we say, right? Technically, it's still an esnan. In other words, why don't you say this? If you say that sleep with your mother Chayiv Misa, so there's no esnan over there. So let's say he gave his mother the lamb. What is it? Is that an esnan or just a gift? It's just a gift. Just no, it's also an esnan. You're not mechuyev to pay. Since he's Chayiv Misa for sleeping with his mother, right? It shouldn't be an esnan, right? Because it's kamar rabine. No, it still is an esnan. In other words, if he took that lamb and he actually gave it to his mother, you couldn't bring that as a carbon. Obviously, these people wouldn't be so, their minds wouldn't be on bringing karbanos to his mother. But the point is that it would be an esnan. And here Rashi says, so that's the point. That yes, you say ein lo k'mashalim. What do you mean ein lo k'mashalim? Yeah, he's not. You can't force him to pay. But if he wants to be Yosef de Shemaim, like Rava said, the esnan, the Torah asert, even Baalimo, it's still an esnan. Take a look at Rashi over here. It's kedai to see the Rashi inside. Rava Omar, about a little bit below where we are. Rava Omar in the middle of the daf. Afil Baalimo, v'noslan tle be'esnan. He gave his mother a lamb, let's say, as a gift. Esanu v'asel carbon. The esnan stomach says loshna ima loshna p'liya. Says esnan, it's the gift of a zona. Ba'afagav di tavla bedina. Let's say she demanded it in court. She said, you slept with me and you promised me a lamb and you haven't paid. Come on. Tenli esnoni, lo machayv, you can't be machayv him, you can't force him to pay. They'll come to Rabbi, right? Because he's getting machayv misa. But if he actually gave his mother the esnu, so is that lachabed esnu, he can't bring it as a carbon. Alma, afil makam misa nami romu tashlumin aleh. Even if machayv misa, like the case I said, we throwing the knife across the yard from one rishus to another and it tore somebody's shirt. Even though you're chayiv misa, you really chayiv, you really should pay. Elish ein koch la'ansho b'sham. Bezin can't force him to pay because it says yashim berisha achas ata machayiv li ata machayiv b'shtei rishos. You can't chayiv him two different punishments. Avlidei shemaim lo yotza sheyishalim. The elo ramu tashlumin. If he's not mechuyev to pay, kiyab ne'elei. Why beresan? If he's not really mechuyev to pay, so if he actually gives it to her, then why is it an esnan? Sunday, he's not mechuyev to give it to her. So it's simply matan be'alma. Matan be'alma would be oblate. By chosinami also tashlum really you have to pay. Elishen koch bez luncho. In other words, you use this animal the whole day. You didn't feed the animal, so you have to feed the animal. But since you're chayiv malchus, we say you don't have to pay. Or you don't have to pay. Yes, but technically you do have to pay. But Bezin just doesn't have the power to impose two punishments on you. And that's the idea. That's the pshat over here at Kol Merabine. That's a pshat that not that you're not chayiv. You're really chayiv, except that Bezin can't impose two different punishments. Rav Papa gives a technical answer. He says, you know why you're not? There's no issue over here of locum sham. The question was, if you were over on muzzling your animal and you didn't on this animal that you used, and you have to give it, you have to pay. Not only you get malchus, but you also have to pay the owner X amount of food, of animal feed. And like a mishalim. So my answer is it goes like Ramero's like mishalim. Rava says we're talking about Yosei Shemayim. You can't mechayiv him to pay. But if he wants to be Yosef Ishmael, he really does. You have to pay. Rav Papa says the technical answer. Common Ramani is only if it was simultaneous. The guy threw the knife and hit the shirt as he was being Machal Shabbos. But over here, B'shas Mashiach he's chayiv to feed this animal. What happened? He rented this animal, right? So if I rent the animal, rent a car, you got to put gas in the car, right? You rent an animal, you got to give the animal animal feed. He's chayiv to feed him as soon as he pulled the animal. In other words, he took it in his own shoes. He doesn't get malchus until he actually muzzled the animal. Not just muzzled the animal, but as we saw yesterday, he used the animal for threshing while the animal was muzzled. Right? You don't have to just. It's not only chayiv if you muzzle it. Let's say I muzzled it the night before, so I didn't muzzle it at the time that I did the threshing. But the answer is don't thresh the animal while it's muzzled. So we don't thresh with the animal while it's muzzled. So over here, the point is that he's chayiv and to feed the animal. The chayiv and tashlumin is as soon as he pulled it into his rishus, he's mechuyev to give him food for the day. Afterwards, he threshed with him, so it's not at the same time, and therefore he can get both punishments. Amra Papa, Hani Mili Boamine Debeira Papa Baraba. The school of Rav Papa Baraba, the yeshiva boys there, asked me these two questions. Upashali Surah, and I decided for them. I paskin that it's asur. They asked me two questions, and I paskin for them it's asur. Charak hilchasa, one halachically correct. The charalaf hilchasa, and one I paskin to them l'chumra, even though that's not the halacha. But I wanted to be machmer that they shouldn't come to make light of the halacha. What was the case? They asked me this question. Are you allowed to knead the dough? Dough, usually we know that you buy a bread or you buy lachmaniya, you assume it's par, right? You can eat it with milchiks or fleishiks. Are you allowed to knead the dough with milk? So he says, so you shouldn't do that. So that's halacha. You should not knead any dough with milk, even though you're planning to eat it, let's say, with a cheese sandwich or something. And if you did, so it's all awesome, because you might come to sin. People see there was when they knew a bakery in upstate New York, they finally got a hashgacha. It was a goyish bakery, but they gave hashgacha, but they noticed that the hot dog buns are milchik. A little problem with that. Remember that? I probably told that story 7.5 years ago, 50 years ago too, right? But Kios was a similar thing. Ain't touching a satana value. You shouldn't grease the oven with the fat tail of an animal, meaning it's sari. Because you're making the bread fleishiks, and people will come to put butter on it. And so the whole thing, all the bread is also until you fire up the tanners, until you kosher the oven again. So that's one thing that I told them. They asked me, are you allowed to knead dough with milk? And I paskin to them this usher, and that's the halacha as we see in this brisa. What was the second kasha that they asked me? They asked me a second shaila that I paskined also le'isr, even though it was nasr. Are you allowed to put? You're not allowed. Plus it says you're not allowed to crossbreed the animals, right? Two different kinds of animals. Am I allowed to put them both in a barn? I put two different animals in a barn. Somebody asked yesterday about a horse and a donkey or whatever. Can I put them in a barn? You're not supposed to crossbreed them. Can I put them in a barn? I didn't crossbreed them. I put them in a barn. Well, partially, I say you shouldn't do that. I shouldn't do it because it can lead to might lead to something bad. All right. Shaloyus also, they shouldn't be. Don't start up, even though you didn't actually mate them, but you shouldn't do that either. It's not the halacha. Shmuel says, listen to this. We know the Torah says adultery is forbidden among human beings, right? All right. So how does somebody die if they committed adultery? Ali Day Bez, I'm talking about with a chiyuv besin. If it's Adam and Asra. Now, what do the Adam see? When the Adam see a man and a woman together, right? Having intercourse together, do they actually see his aver entering her body? They actually see that? It says no. When it comes to menafim, meaning as adulterers, all they have to see them is their posture. If they're lying in a position of sex, that's all they have to see, and you can kill them. If there was Adam and there was Asra, you can kill them based on that. You might say, wait a minute, did you actually see his penis entering her vagina? Did you see that? Well, you didn't see it. That's all you need. Shmuel says that's the halacha, because otherwise it's impossible. You can't always see that. Now, Farshim talk about would she be usher to her husband? Not necessarily so in that case, but whatever. But that's a different shaila. But the idea is that for us, those you don't have to look so carefully. It's not so important. You're not going to. The Edom aren't going to go look at their genitals. Over client, when it comes to crossbreeding animals, when are you chayiv? No, you're only chayiv if you actually mate them physically, meaning you take his aver and put it in the female. Like the paintbrush in the tube. You have a tube of paint, and you actually put the brush or the stick into the tube. Basically, you're mimicking it. That's a way of describing the bia of animals. So he says you're not chayiv unless that. So what does that mean? Shmuel said you're not chayiv when are you chayiv from mating, crossbreeding animals? If you actually take the animals, the male's aver, and put it in the female's body. So what did he mean? So therefore, when the Talmidim asked him, are you allowed to put, let's say, a horse and a donkey in a barn and close the door? Is that forbidden? He says, don't do that. What do you mean? Shmuel just said it's only also, you only considered crossbreeding if you actually mate them physically, if you actually mate them. Okay, but he said I didn't paskin like the halacha. The halacha is you only chayiv for crossbreeding if you actually physically do it. But if you just put them in the barn, you're not chayiv. But I paskin anyway that way. Tosfos asks, how do you know that it's lav kilkusa? Because Shmuel says you're only chayiv if that, right? Maybe it's the lost drabanan. In other words, Shmuel's talking about Midoraisa, as we see very often. We're talking about are you chayiv on adulterers, on human adulterers? You're only chayiv. We're talking about chayiv misa b'dei adam. Talking about the Doraisa. So, but Klayim, you could say when it comes to crossbreeding animals, maybe you're only chayiv Doraisa if you did it that way, but it still could be an issue drabanan to put them in the barn together. So Tosfos asked Tema, how did he know? How did Rav Papa say over here? I paskin not like the halacha, because Shmuel says on Klayim you're only usher if you actually physically mate them. But maybe over here, maybe you only chayiv min Torah. You're chayiv malchus for behem tchalos sabiyah Klayim only if you physically mate them. But if you put them in the barn together, it might be still a rabbanan. So why did he say I didn't paskin lahalacha? I was machmer. How did he know? Maybe the case of Shmuel is doraisa, and rabbanan could still be us. If the pasuk would say, don't mate your animals. If we just say b'hem lo sabiyah, just say that. How would I understand that? Don't hold. In other words, if you're a farmer and you want to mate your animals, so maybe the farmers would hold the female down while the male descends upon her. If it would say maybe say you shouldn't do that. Let nature take its course, but you shouldn't have any part of that act. Why not? Okay, maybe because it's improper to look at animals when they mate, etc. That's what I would say if I don't say Mabraham Tchalos Arbiyah. But Tamalomer Kalayim, no, it means that you shouldn't mate them if you're crossbreeding them. It's mashma that you shouldn't hold them down. In other words, don't hold on to the female, don't like hold her in place while the male descends upon her. Maybe why did you say that in the Shmuel said that the issue of crossbreeding is only if you physically take the male genital and put it in the female? Here it's mashma, even if you just hold the female down. You shouldn't even do that. Gemara says, no, my achiza over here means holding on to it. Actually means putting the male genital inside the female. But my question, why is it called achiza, holding on? Bishamayim wants to use a nice lashon. You don't want to say literally, holding on to the genital, so you say holding it down. Maybe that's what it means. Let's say you're a farmer, and the animals are not reproducing as you expect them to, right? You're allowed to do that. Your farmer is allowed to take two animals, a horse and a horse, or a donkey and a donkey, and make them literally taking his aver, the male aver, and put it in the female. So there's not even a question over here of promiscuity. My time, but he's busy farming. In other words, Rashi points out, it's improper to look at animals when they're mating. When animals are mating, it's improper because it could lead to impure thoughts. But if a farmer is doing it in order to breed his animals, he's allowed to, because he's not thinking about that. He's thinking about his work, and therefore it's not improper. Now, Rav Achdeve asked that kasha on this halacha that we brought down from Shmuel. It's mashma b'hem b'lasabiyah. That's only holding them. It's mashma that even on holding them, if you're holding the animal for crossbreeding, that alone is the yisr. That alone is the yisr. He says no. It means now he asked a similar kasha again, maybe because he was hoping for a different answer, or maybe it was said at the same time. The same kasha, the same kind of a question. It says ilu nemar b'hem chalos. If we only say b'hem chalos arbiyah, I might think shouldn't hold down the female. Why? You shouldn't hold her down when the male descends upon it. Tamalomer kalayim hu the usher, right? It's only usher if they're crossbreeding. Hamin b'mino shari, but if it would be the same min, it's mutter. Umin b'mino nami achiza ein achnasa lo. It's mashma the same thing that it klayim huda aser, but min b'mino you're allowed to. Min b'mino also is only achiza, holding on to her. But who says that you're allowed to breed the animals physically by holding on to the genitals? Hey, achnas lo. So the Gemara is the same answer. It's my achiza achnasa. It means that you're allowed to. That's what you're not allowed to do by crossbreeding. You're allowed to do with the same breed. If you're doing a horse with a horse, you're allowed to. By my part, that's why it's called achiza lishnamal. You just wanted to use a nice lashon again because the Tana who said the Brisa wanted to use a nice lashon, didn't want to talk about physically holding on to the genital. So lishmaya Amar Ravashi Hamil Saboy Mine Mino the debate of Nehemiah Reish Chalusa in the yeshiva of Nehemiah, who was the exilar. They asked me this kasha. Can you put 3 animals into a barn? Okay. Again, obviously you cannot mate. You cannot crossbreed by taking and the animal's genital and put it in the female's genital. You can't do that. But can I put and we said before he asked the kasha that the Rav Papa said, can you take 2 animals of different breeds, one's female, one's male, and put them in a barn? He said you shouldn't do that, even though technically maybe Shmuel didn't answer that. Maybe it's not even a Drabanan, that's like Tosas Kasha was. But he asked this kasha, can you take min b'mina? Can you put a donkey, let's say, and a mare, not a horse and a mare? Can you put the same min, right, a male and a female, and a female of another one? You have 3 animals. Good, 2 of them are the same male and female of the same species, and then a 3rd animal of not the same species. Can you do that? Again, you have a min and it's a man, the same species, and since the horse has its own species, he's not gonna. The horse is not going to go with the donkey if he has a mare there. He has his own. He has a female horse. Even so, you shouldn't, because it might lead to something bad. And he told him. Ravashi said, "I possibly Isur the local. That's not the halacha. You're allowed to. Even you're allowed to. We said before that even Rav Papa said that a min b'shenim, when you put a horse, let's say, with a female donkey, you're allowed to halachically, but I paskin to Isur lav keilchasa. So this is certainly lav keilchasa. Mishum prususa davdi, because the avodim, the slaves who are involved, who are the farmers' servants, might lead to promiscuity with this kind of a thing. So therefore, he said you shouldn't even do that. Not only a male horse with a female donkey alone, but even a male horse with a female horse and a donkey and a female donkey, that you shouldn't do either. That's how Ravashi paskin. Again, not kehilchasa, but it was more machmer. Back to the case of a worker working in the field. He's allowed to not only an animal we saw as an animal, whether it's mechuber or not mechuber. Same thing with a worker. He's allowed to eat that. Let's say he was only working with his hands, not with his feet. He was stationary. Or or he was working with his feet, not with his hands. He wasn't using his hands. Whatever the work was, let's say he was trotting on the grapes in a wine press, right? So he was working with his feet, not with his hands. I feel b'kseifa, or only with his shoulder, meaning he wasn't using his hands at all. He wasn't moving his hands and feet, but he was schlepping or something, working with the shoulder. Hareza ochel. The Tanna Kama says that any work, it says kisava b'kamas reyacha. You come into the vineyard, whatever. It doesn't say what work you had to do there. You come in there, you're working, you're allowed to eat. The worker's allowed to eat from the food. As we said, he's allowed mechuber l'karka when it's being detached, and non-mechuber l'karka if it's already been detached until the process has been completed for meiser or challah. Rav Yosef says no, you got to work with hands and feet. If he doesn't work with hands and feet, then he can't eat. Why? We'll see. My time. What is the reason of Tanna Kama? Why he says if you work at all, he says you come into your vineyard. We're talking about a worker. The pasuk before we had a drasha, how we know that it's speaking about a worker. You come in as a worker into the vineyard. Whatever you work there, you're mutter to eat. Didn't say what kind of work. If you have to work with your hands and feet. My time there is Kishore, just like a shore, mashore, a shore obviously can only work with his hands and feet because his hands and feet are his feet, right? So he can't work unless he's doing something with hands and feet. Okay, so that's how Rabbi Yosef learns. Obviously, we pass like the Tanna Kama. Boy, Rav Huna asks this kasha according to Yosef Dash Bavzim Zon go Yosef Mao. What happens if he threshed not with a cow or a heavy animal, but he threshed with geese or chickens or something? According to Yosef, Yehuda says you have to work with hands and feet like a shore, 4 feet. Well, these animals only have 2 feet. Mao, with all of the feet that you have, all of your strength, so to speak. And a shore has 4 feet, but a tarnagal or a geese only has 2 feet, and he's using all the strength that he has. Well, he have that. You need hands and feet, and he doesn't have hands and feet; he only has 2 feet. Well, take with that question stands. Obviously, so you talk about by we're talking about animals. I mean, we compared workers, human beings, to animals too, and a human being doesn't have 4 feet, but he has 2 hands. So maybe that's what he means here also. You learn like a shore, uses hands and feet. Okay, but a bird that only has 2 feet, what would it be for you to say there? Maybe he's not allowed to eat. Let's say they're working in a wine press. They have to until they walk both lengthwise and crosswise. They can eat grapes. But they can't drink the wine because there's no wine yet. When they've only walked one way, everything's still in this, walked in one direction. Everything is still considered grapes. They can't drink the wine, right? Of course, like you pointed out yesterday, you can give them before they go to work. Then the worker's allowed to. You can give them a cup of wine before they go to work, right? But they're allowed to. But when they only started, when the vat is full of grapes, there's no wine there yet. There's no wine there, so they can only drink. They can only take grapes. Can't have wine. As we see, this really is related to the next mission, that you can only eat the kind of food that you're working with. Okay, so here, when there's only grapes, they can't drink wine. Once they've walked both lengthwise and crosswise, we got in the wine press. They could do both. They could eat grapes and drink wine because they're working with both. This shows you that wine and grapes are 2 different things, as we know. On grapes, you make a bar per eitz. On yain, you make a bar per gafen. Gafen has a different condition. So even though the wine is made from grapes, but they're considered 2 separate things. Let's say he was working today on the figs, and there's also grapes in the field. Can't eat the grapes. You can only eat from what you're working with. He's working with grapes. Okay, why do we say both ways? We'll see. Let's say he says, okay, you know what? In the morning, I'm working on figs. If I finish after lunch, if I get all the way there, as I continue through the field, they're going to be grapes later on. I prefer the grapes. So if he wants, he can restrain himself until he gets to the grapes or until the fruits that he desires, and he can eat there. But again, when he gets there, he can only eat from what he's working on. Okay. Now we'll see in a minute. The Gemara is going to discuss. It has to be from the very vine that he's working on, the very tree, or just to be the same species. Because the Mishnah says if he's working with figs, he can eat figs. If he's working with grapes, he can only eat grapes. If he's working with grapes, he can't eat figs. But if he wants, he doesn't have to eat right now. He can restrain himself and hold back, build a bigger appetite because he knows at 3 o'clock in the afternoon he's going to get to the fruits that he wants to eat, as long as he's going to be working on it. All these things really you could only eat while you're working. Avo. The Chacham made it what does it mean returning a lost item to the Balaam? The Balaam sometimes would prefer if you eat even when you're not working because it'll save time. What do we mean by that? Because that means he gives an example. Let's say the workers are in a field, they work in one row. Then they have to walk over. It takes a minute or 2 to walk to the next row. So even though when they're walking to the next row, they're not working. They're just walking. They're between jobs, so to speak, right? So you're not technically they shouldn't be allowed to eat. But the rabbi said, you know what? The owner prefers if they would eat at that time because they'll be able to work better when they get to the next row. They won't have to stop to eat. So the worker doesn't mind. The owner doesn't mind if when they're walking from row number 1 to row number 2, they take a few grapes or apples or whatever from row number 1 and eat them while they're walking. That's what he means. That technically, Minatora, you're only allowed to eat b'shas malacha. When they're walking between jobs or on break, you can't eat. But because of a Shos Haveda, sometimes the owner prefers that they eat even when they're not working because they'll be more productive when they get to the next row or the next job. Or when they're returning from the vat, from the wine press. better they eat then, because this way when they're in the wine press, they'll do more work. They don't mind. And the chamor is allowed to eat. We'll see what it means from the load on his back while he's being unloaded. Until he gets unloaded, he's allowed to eat even though he's no longer working in the field. Let's say we said, okay, if you're working on grapes, you can only eat grapes. You can't eat figs. But if you're working on one geffen, on one vine, can you eat from another vine? It's all grapes. Okay, I'm working with the different vines. Can I take from a different? I'm working on this vine. Can I take from another vine or not? From the species that you're putting into the basket. What are you doing? You're picking grapes, right? So you're taking the grapes and putting them into the owner's basket. It's enough from the same species. I'm picking grapes. I could take the grape from a different vine. You have to do from the very same one, from the same vine. From the vine that I'm putting grapes into the owner's basket, I'm allowed to eat from that vine, but not from another vine. You don't have that. You'll tell me, if you tell me, well, if I'm working on one vine, I cannot eat from another vine. So we learned before that a shore and a person, an animal and a person, have basically the same malachas. They can eat when they are detaching the food, and after the food has been detached, until such time as it's fully processed. So if you tell me that you can't eat from a different vine, think about it. How do they have the shore? The shore was in a yoke pulling a wagon. The people on the wagon were picking the grapes. Right? The shore is in the front as he's pulling the wagon. If you say that you can only eat from the vine that you're working on, how is the shore ever going to eat? They're picking the vine. The people on the wagon are picking from the vines on the sides of the wagon. How can the shore eat from that? It's almost impossible. If you say that if you're working on one vine, you cannot eat from another vine, well, they're working on the vine next to the wagon. How could the shore eat? That's not a kash from Shesha Bredavidi, Bisharcha or Bishedcha, Vidalit. He says the Vidalit meaning where it's one long vine. It's a very long vine from there. The shore, the vine stretches all the way from the back of the wagon or the side of the wagon all the way to the front where the shore is. So that's not such a kasha. But it seems more mastabra that, well, we can't really tell. It's mashma from the Rambam's Zeichner that also began and said, Lo yochel began Toshma. Let's try to bring a proof. So we have this question. We know that if you're working with grapes, you can only eat grapes. But can you only eat the grapes from this particular tree that you're picking from, or if it's whatever's or this vine, or if you're picking figs, you can only eat from that tree. Tashmayos b'teinim le'chol. Mishnah said that if you're working with figs, you can't eat grapes. But if, let's say, figs and figs, dumya teinim and of them are two different trees, obviously, right? The figs are on a fig tree, then of them are on a grapevine, right? So it says if you're eating figs, you can't eat grapes. Mashma, figs and figs, similar to figs and grapes, because they're on two different trees. Oh, you could. You say you can only eat from the same vine. How does that work? It's mashma says if I'm working with figs, I can eat other figs. Figs and figs, like figs and grapes, meaning two different trees, I could. So if you say you can't eat, how does that work? I'm Rav Shesha Breda again, the mudless, when it's overhanging. It's possible many times that a vine is overhanging a fig tree, or figs are overhanging a vine, depending on how closely they were planted together. So it could be you're working on both at the same time. That's the point. You're working on both because in order to get the grapes, you have to lift up the figs, or in order to get the figs, you have to lift up the vine that has grapes on it in order to get the figs. So you're working on one. It's possible you're working on both at the same time, and yet even though you're working on both at the same time, if it's figs and figs, you're working on both at the same time, so you're allowed to take them, or grapes and grapes. But if it's grapes and figs, you're only allowed to take the stuff that you're putting into the basket. If you're picking grapes, and you're at this point you're putting grapes in the basket. But you might be working with the fig also because the fig is overhanging the grapes, so the grapes are having the figs. That's what we mean over here. So he says, how is it possible? He says, you shouldn't, if you're working on figs, you shouldn't eat grapes. If you're working on figs, if you're working on grapes, you shouldn't work on figs. Mashma that figs and figs you could. And if you say that you open gap and say you can't work with another gap, how is that possible? The answer is possible when they're overhanging one another. You're working with both of them. In order to get the grapes, you have to lift up the figs. But if all you're doing is loading the grapes into the basket, you may not take of the figs, even though you're working with them. So again, it's no proof from the fact that tainum and tainum or grapes or mutter doesn't mean from a different from something you're not working on. You can still only take from the particular tree or vine that you're working on. Tashma, another proof. We said in the Mishnah, you can eat from anything at your choice, but only what you're working. But if you want, you can hold back and not eat until the afternoon, until you get to the nice ones. If you say that if you're working with one vine, you can take from another vine. So what's your problem? Why do you have to wait till 3 o'clock till you get to that vine? Go to that vine now, get it, and eat it. If you say there's a nicer vine up yonder, right? So go take, and you want to eat those. So go take those and eat those while you're working on these. If while working on one vine you're allowed to eat. We're talking about grapes, right? You can only eat grapes. You're working on grapes today, but there's nicer grapes over there. And if you say, you can wait till you get there. Why do you have to wait? Go take the grapes there, right, and eat them now while you're working on these grapes. If you like, if you're allowed to eat grapes from a different vine while you're working from vine number 2, while you're working on vine number 1, why don't you just go take them? What's the problem? Why do you have to wait till 3 o'clock in the afternoon till you get there? Go take them now. So there, it's because we don't want you to lose time from work, because you're going to go schlep them. There's no question. Our question is, if his wife and children are with him, meaning unpaid other workers are with him, and he wouldn't be losing time. In other words, if he says, even if you say that you're allowed to take from vine number 2 while you're working on vine number 1, that's if it doesn't involve loss of time from work. That's what we mean over. Our question is if it doesn't involve loss of time from work. For example, his family members who are not paid workers here can go get those grapes for him. That's our question. Can you do that? Can you do that? There, it means that you shouldn't go spend time schlepping other stuff. Wait till you get there. But maybe in this case, where if it wouldn't involve a loss of time, maybe you could eat from vine number 2 while you're working on vine number 1. Tashma, another. All these things you're only allowed to eat only when you're working on those things. But in order to return a lost item, meaning in order to do the balam, the owner, a favor, because he prefers that you shouldn't lose time from working. They said workers can work while they're working from one row, walking from one row to another when they're not really working. They're just going to work. Because when they come back from the wine press. So we assume that walking is also like working. Why could you eat? Because the owner is happy when I'm walking from row number 1 to row number 2. We said the owner allows you, you're allowed to eat. What are you eating when you're walking from row number 1 to row number 2? From number 1 or from number 2? If you finish row number 1 and you're walking from row number 1 to row number 2, and let's say it takes 5 minutes to walk, what are you eating? You're eating the stuff from row number 1 that you picked already. Row number 2 you didn't get to yet. So if you say that's why you're allowed to midaraisa. But midaraisa you can't eat. In other words, he said that technically you can only work from what you're working on, right? So when you're walking from row number 1 to row number 2, you're working, but you're not working on row number 2 yet. You're going there, but you're not working yet. You're really going to work on number 2, but you're eating from row number 1, right? You're eating from row number 1 while you're working, while you're going to row number 2. We're assuming that going there is like part of the work. So you're working on what? You're not working on number 1 anymore, because you finished number 1, you're going to row number 2. So going there is like part of working on number 2, yet you're eating number 1. Oh, and what do we say there? And you're allowed. So why are you allowed to? Only because of Hashavas Aveda, but midaraisa you're not allowed to. Why are you not allowed to? Why, when I walk from row number 1 to row number 2, what do we say? You're allowed to eat, because it's better for the owner. The owner's happy if you eat. But midaraisa you're not allowed to eat. Why are you not allowed to eat? Why aren't you allowed to eat? Presumably because when you're eating from number 1 while you're working on number 2, that shows you that truth is you can eat from number 1 while you're working on number 2. The reason why midaraisa you cannot eat is because you're not working, not because you're work. The reason why when you're walking from row number 1 to row number 2, the reason why minatorah you're not allowed to eat is not because you're eating from one while you're working on two. You're not working at all. That's not considered work. You can have some say the other way around. So when you're walking, like we said in the answer just now, walking from row number two, you're not working at all. Time, that's the reason why I made a rice because you're not working. Because you're not working at all. When you're not working, you can't eat. But if it's considered like eating a maisa, if it's considered like working on number two, you would be able to. You could eat. In other words, the reason why you can't eat when you can't eat from when you're walking from row number one to row number two is not because you can't eat from one fig from one tree while you're working on another tree, because you're not working. You're not working. You're just walking from row number two. You can't eat at all. But if you would be working, you would be able to eat from one tree while you're working on another tree. Maybe you can't. In other words, the proofs go both ways. Maybe you can't. If you're eating from row, if you're working on row number one, you cannot eat from row number two. And when you're walking, that is like your maisa. In other words, when you're walking to row number two, it's like you're working on row number two. So, but midaraisa, you can't eat. Why can't you eat grapes? Because you can't work on row number two and eat fruits from row number one. You can't eat the grapes from row number one while you're working on row number two. And that's why. So can we bring a proof? We can't bring all these proofs. We can't bring a proof all the way. It could very well be that you can't eat from one or two. And mahalach is kosa maisa, is like a maisa. So the question is osam. If you say mahalach is kosa maisa, that means that you're working on number two. You're working on number two. And min Torah, you cannot eat. Why can't you eat? Oh, because you're eating number one's fruits while you're working on number two. Maybe that's one way to look at it. Or you could say, no, the reason you can't eat min Torah when you're walking from number two is not because there's a problem eating from one tree while you're working on another tree. It's because you're not working then. You're not working at all. When you're not working at all, that's why you can't eat. But it could very well be that if you working on tree number one, you could eat from tree number two if it's the same species. Obviously, that's clear. It's got to be the same species. But our question was, if I'm eating from the same species, but I'm not working on that tree, can I take from one tree, or let's say two fig trees? If I'm working on fig tree number one, can I eat from fig tree number two? That question we really were not poshed, and it seems from the Rambam that it would be awesome. One more line of a chamakshi porekas. What do you mean porekas meichanacha? Where's he eating from? The assumption Rashi says is that when you unload a donkey, you just take it all off in one shot. So while he's being unloaded, what is he eating from? Ema achi porekas, meaning this: that a donkey has a load of food on its back. He's allowed to eat from that food until it's unloaded. As in, the donkey's allowed to eat food, let's say, not only when he's threshing, but he's also allowed to eat because it's good for the owner. The owner's happy if he eats while he's walking, so it saves time and effort for the animal while he's working. He'll work better, and he's allowed to eat from the food on his back. Tanina, this is a proof. This was what we saw in the Mishnah when the Mishnah says it's a proof to what we learned in a Brayso. The Tanur Rabbanan chamor v'gamol, a donkey or a camel, they're allowed to eat from the food on their back, from the bird on their back. In other words, you're not allowed if you're taking this animal, right? It's your animal, but the burden belongs to the balabait or somebody else. You're not allowed to take food from the back of the animal and give it to him. That's not. He's allowed to eat from detached food, or he's allowed to eat from food that's on the ground. But you're not allowed to take from the burden on its back, which has a certain, it's got a weight to it, and it's all a consignment. It's all that. It's got a packing slip. You're not allowed to do that. But if the animal takes from the food on its back, he's allowed to do that until he's fully unloaded. The Mishnah, tomorrow's Mishnah, we'll just see the Mishnah quickly says, Ochel Pol Kish Safilu B'Dinner. Makes no difference how much is he allowed to eat. What happens if he eats more, the worker eats more than he's being paid? He's paid $5 an hour and he eats $6 worth of fruits. So he says you can eat cucumbers and feel dinner, even if it's worth more than he's being paid. Or koseva is the same thing, whether it's cucumbers or whether it's dates. He shouldn't eat more than his paycheck. Chacham say you're allowed to. But you teach him you shouldn't be a glutton. We'll close the door in front of him. In other words, it's logical. We'll see the halachas like the Chachamim being that, they hold like the Tanakama, you're allowed to eat whatever you want, but you teach him, don't eat too much, otherwise nobody's going to hire you. If you eat more than your paycheck, nobody's going to hire you. Yes, just wanted to point out yesterday, Moshe asked, he didn't have to answer directly, but he asked about Sirus, about castrating animals, or people for that matter, that we said that that's an Doraisa. It's actually, we had it a couple of weeks ago in the Pasuk. We talk about animals that you can't bring as a carbon, and Malach, Vakasas, Vanasa, Vakarslos, like Rebel Hashem, Uba Artsachem Losasu, and in your land you shouldn't do that. That's the source, that's the Doraisa of Sirus, that shows you that you're not allowed to castrate, you're not to castrate animals, and certainly applies to human beings also, can't be castrated. If you do it, like say, like today, if they do it with with medicine or something like that, with pills or a syrup or something like that, where you didn't physically cut the animal, then it's still usher, but you wouldn't get malchus for that. All right, we'll pick up here tomorrow. Have a good day.
Good, yeah,